Hello, and thank you for listening to this presentation. My name's Mike Thelwall. I'm a Professor of Data Science at the University of Wolverhampton in the UK, and I'm going to talk about Altmetrics now and in the near future. So this is a really big conference, so I'm going to give a general introduction and not assume that you're an experienced researcher or that you have a lot of experience of Altmetrics. I'm going to assume that you're quite new to the field and would like to have a general overview. So this talk is going to be a general overview of Altmetrics. So what I think the situation is now, and also what we're likely to have in the near future. I'm going to start off by looking at different perspectives for Altmetrics, and starting with the perspective of publishers. So if you're a publisher now, someone like Wiley, Blackwell, or PLOS, you have a variety of choices about Altmetrics. So you can buy them from a commercial provider such as altmetric.com or PubMed. You can make your own Altmetrics like PLOS do with their Legato software, and maybe with the help of the Crossref event data. And you can also use or report your internal download or sharing Altmetrics, data about how often people have access the information in your repository. And this is the +1 example. So here is altmetric data about an article in +1, and you can see cumulative views graphed at the top, so you can see the trending time in terms of the number of people that have downloaded or viewed the paper, and you can see citation type metrics at the bottom, Mendeley readers, some tweets, and no comments in this case. So these are scores that +1 have gathered themselves or linked to from other sources. If you're a scientist, what can you do about Altmetrics? How can you get Altmetrics? So if you're a scientist, you wouldn't go to an Altmetric provider and ask for a deal for just your papers, but you can get Altmetrics for your own articles from the publisher websites. The publishers that subscribe to one of the service providers or gather their own Altmetrics will put the scores alongside articles, as we saw on the previous slide, so you can just access your article and see the scores. You could install the altmetric.com bookmarklet in your web browser, and then whenever you're on a web page about a journal article, you click the bookmarklet and it gives you the Altmetric score for that article. Or you could convert the DOI of your article into a PubMed URL in this format, and then you'll get a page of Altmetrics from PubMed about the article. You can also get the information on dimensions.ai pages for your article. And here are some examples. So at the top, we can see the PubMed metrics for an article queried by DOI. Just a summary, you click on the figures and you get more detailed information, and at the bottom you can see the Altmetric widget for an article after clicking on the Altmetric bookmarklet in my web browser. And again, you get a quick summary, and you click on the summary and it takes you to a detailed information page. So both of these give you quick ideas about where an article is attracting attention, where on the web an article is attracting attention, and maybe gives you useful information about the context of the attention that it's attracting. What if you're an evaluator or a librarian? What kind of data would you access? What can you get now? Well, you can buy analytics packages with Altmetrics from altmetric.com or PubMed, and they will come with the Altmetric scores, plus also software to help you analyze the results for your institution or for your purposes. So you get not just the data, but the analytics to analyze the data. Or you could collect your own data, and this is useful for high value projects with custom requirements. There's a high overhead to collecting your own Altmetric data, so it's only recommended if you're running a high value project and the current service providers don't give you the kind of information that you need. So for our own projects, we usually collect our own data, and we usually have evaluations that are very specific and for which we need to put together a portfolio of Altmetrics that reflect the specific requirements of our customers. And we usually deal with customers that create very non-traditional impacts for which the standard Altmetrics don't capture impact in the way that they'd like to, the organisations would like to. And what if you're a scientometrician, so someone who's researching Altmetrics, not interested so much in the Altmetrics for their own articles, but they're assessing the value of Altmetrics, or they're using Altmetrics to come up with new applications for them, or to investigate science through Altmetrics. So if you're researching into Altmetrics, then I'm going to call you a scientometrician for convenience. Well, you can get free bulk data from altmetric.com. You can, if you ask them nicely, they might give you access to all their scores in a huge database. There's an API with altmetric.com, a computer programming interface that allows you to query their database for specific Altmetric scores. And there are other APIs that can give you Altmetric data, such as the Mendeley.com API, which will allow you to query for the Mendeley reader information for any article. And there is also free cross-ref event data about citation and Altmetric type events that you can access for free. So for the API solutions, you would need programming expertise to access the data and then convert it into something of that's useful for your purposes. And there are also free data collection tools such as Webmetric Analyst, which is my own tool. And as a researcher, you can also write your own code to harness the APIs or use web crawling to gather the information that you need for your project. So there are lots of different options for scientometricians, and there's a lot of data that you can access relatively easily as a researcher to study Altmetrics or to apply Altmetrics to a particular problem. I'd like to now look at what we know about Altmetrics so far. We've had, I guess, well, depending on how you classify Altmetrics, we've had 1 or 2 decades of research about them. So we know quite a lot of things about Altmetrics. So I'm going to classify the results on one slide, summarize the whole of knowledge about Altmetrics on one slide into various different groups. So first of all, coverage. A few Altmetrics have non-zero values for most articles, but most Altmetrics have non-zero scores for only a small minority of articles. So if you pick an Altmetric at random and an article at random, the score's probably 0. The main exceptions are Mendeley and Twitter, for which you could expect most articles to have a non-zero score. So coverage is something that's important for Altmetrics. Also, the scores themselves, for every Altmetric score, it's very sensitive to the publication year, the field in which the article is published, and an important limitation of Altmetrics is that they can be very hard to norm reference. So you have a score of 5, say, for one particular Altmetric. It's quite difficult to say whether that's good or bad. So altmetric.com solve this by giving you percentiles. They'll report that your article is in the top 5% for a particular Altmetric. So that's helpful to help you norm reference it. Speed. Almost all Altmetrics are much more quick to appear than citations. So if you're after evidence of some kind of impact, then Altmetrics are likely to give that evidence before citation counts do. And that's very important for research, because the gap between doing research and getting it published is already likely to be about a year at least. And if there's another gap on top of that between being published and getting cited, then we're starting to talk about a substantial period of time between someone doing the research and having some kind of impact evidence for it. So speed is a big advantage of Altmetrics, and especially because you can get useful scores quite quickly after an article is published. Within a month of publishing an article, you could get some idea about whether it's attracting online attention at least. And the most important one probably is interpretation and the need to be humble when using Altmetrics. And overall, some Altmetrics have very clear interpretations. For example, the Syllabus mention Altmetric is clearly an educational impact Altmetric because it directly counts papers adding value to education. So that's a clear one. But others have very unclear impact interpretations, such as tweet counts. And they're unclear because tweets can be used for many different purposes by many different people. So it's not really possible to say what each individual tweet represents in terms of impact or other evidence. So I would say that most Altmetrics have unclear impact interpretations in general. And I would also say that all Altmetrics have biases, often very substantial biases, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And also on the humble side, the absence of impact evidence is not evidence of impact absence. So an article which has a score on any Altmetric or even all Altmetrics doesn't necessarily have no impact. It just means that on the Altmetrics, they haven't captured any evidence of impact. So you can have a legitimate reason why an important article hasn't had any Altmetric scores. So it's particularly important to remember if you're an evaluator, you shouldn't be telling researchers your research has had no impact because nobody's tweeted it. So that's a good way to upset people. And how to research Altmetrics. So we have a standard set of techniques for researching Altmetrics in order to assess their value. So correlation tests are the most common, usually with citations, sometimes with human judgments. Content analysis of the context of the Altmetrics. Predicting citations with Altmetrics is done a little bit as well. Regression analyses. And the importance of using skew-safe statistics is a particular one for me because you have very skewed data sets with Altmetrics, lots of very low scores and a few very high scores. It's usually best to avoid the arithmetic mean, for example, taking a simple average of Altmetrics because it tells you more about the high values than the average values. And how to use them effectively, I think this is where we're the weakest at the moment, really. We know that we can use them in support of narrative impact claims. So as a researcher, you write some statements explaining what kind of impact you believe you've had, and then you can use Altmetrics to help support that claim, provide evidence in support of that claim. And that's used a lot in the UK at the moment for the impact case studies that we're writing for the end of this year, beginning of next year, for the government to assess us. Altmetrics are good as optional partial evidence of impact. So using the scores to show that impact has happened, but not using the absence of scores to show that impact hasn't happened. So one way is okay, the other way isn't okay. And then the third type, I think, we can use Altmetrics to investigate science or impact type. So a more, not an evaluative reason, but to investigate the role of science itself and the patterns of science. So these are three ways I can think of to use them effectively. Maybe you can think of more than these. And maybe you can think of important things that I've left out about Altmetrics now. So if so, please add them to the comments or make questions. ask me questions about them. I'd like to go through 3 altmetrics just to give a brief flavour of different types of altmetric. So I'm starting with my favourite one, Mendeley reader counts. So these in terms of coverage are high. Most articles have at least one Mendeley reader, so the coverage is very good. The interpretation of Mendeley reader counts, so their scholarly impact similar to citation impact, and they also have a degree of educational impact. And this is because Mendeley is mainly used by academics, but also some students, particularly on an MSc or PhD. So their research and a little bit of educational impact is the interpretation. And they're good for early evidence of scholarly impact, because you tend to get Mendeley readers for your papers about a year before you get citations for them. So they're early scholarly impact evidence. And the biases, so they have some biases, not huge biases, but they are biased against topics and researchers in countries that don't use Mendeley much, such as China. So if you want to compare the impact of American against Chinese research, then Mendeley wouldn't be a good choice. Although in theory, academia is completely international, so you can publish research anywhere in the world, and researchers from anywhere in the world can and do cite it. In general, you get disproportionately many citations from your own country, even if your research isn't of particular interest to that country. So international comparisons are not good for Mendeley, but apart from that, I think that's its main bias. And to collect it, we know you can get it from Altmetrics service providers, you can get it from API calls, or Webmetric Analyst, my own program, using the Zahedi-Haustein-Bowman method of collecting Mendeley reader counts comprehensively. And second type of altmetric tweet accounts, these are the ones that are probably best known about, I would say, as an altmetric. These have a high coverage. Most articles have been tweeted at least once. Interpretation, I would say it's attention or publicity, a combination of attention and publicity. And in medical fields, and maybe some other fields, maybe professional fields, elements of societal impact or professional impact. But in general, tweet counts are difficult to interpret because of the high publicity element in them. The journal can publicize an article, the author can publicize the article, and this means that it's hard to use the number of tweets about an article as evidence of its societal impact. And it's also hard to know who's tweeted about an article, because the tweets can come from any type of user, the public, scientists, or professional users. And a value would be for early evidence of attention or publicity in general. So you can expect your article to be tweeted in the week in which it's first published. So you do get very quick evidence of attention or publicity. And the biases are against topics and researchers in countries not using Twitter much, like China, same as Mendeley. But I would say this is a more severe bias than Mendeley, much more severe bias. And some topics are more natural for Twitter than others. So I think you get a big a bias from that as well. So some topics are intrinsically more tweetable because Twitter is a public medium, so it's something that you want to share in public if you tweet about an article. And you can collect tweets with Altmetrics service providers. There is an API for Twitter, but it's not really practical for individual researchers to use to gather tweets, I think, especially on a long term, but it is technically possible. So tell me if I'm wrong and you're doing that, please. And one other Syllabus mentions. So this is an altmetric with low coverage. I think maybe at most 1% of articles are mentioned in an academic syllabus anywhere that can be found in public, because most syllabi are private. And if your paper is cited in an academic syllabus, a core syllabus, then it's evidence of educational value because it's being used to help educate students. So this is an easy one for interpretation. So the value is evidence of educational value. Some research is very heavily used in education but not cited much, so syllabus mentions would be fantastic for that kind of research. And the biases would be against topics not feeding into educational curricula, and also against languages not covered by data collectors. For example, if your article was extensively used in Vietnam, and I don't think Vietnamese is covered by any of the major altmetric providers, then you would probably get a score of 0 for your article, despite having a large educational impact. And collection, so you can get syllabus mentions from Altmetrics service providers, and you can also collect them in Webmetric Analyst with special custom search engine queries. Another type of relatively clear interpretation altmetric is the policy mention. So coverage very low. A policy mention means that your research has been cited in a government or other, maybe NGO policy document, and you can use that as evidence that your research has influenced policy. So I think that's very low coverage. This is just a guess. So evidence of policy influence is very valuable if you want to persuade people that your research is useful, as we're doing in the UK at the moment. And it's biased against countries without open policy documents, or policy documents that don't cite academic research directly or clearly enough, or that aren't indexed by the providers. So it's very internationally biased, I think. And you can get the results from Overton.io, UNAIDS creation, Altmetrics service providers, and also for your country, bespoke web crawlers you could create if you're a programmer to access your own government's policy documents if they're online and not already collected. And just briefly to mention a few other altmetrics so nobody feels left out. So Facebook wall posts, a bit like tweet counts. Wikipedia citations, these are rare, but they provide value of informational support for your research, so I think they're quite useful. Patent citations, evidence of commercial impact if you're cited in a patent, because the role of patent is to protect money. And clinical guideline citations, if your research is cited in a document that's telling doctors and health professionals what to do, then you can claim health impact. And news mentions, if you're cited in a news article, then that's evidence of public interest. But this is hard to systematically gather. You can get the data from Altmetrics service providers, but I think they can't crawl all the major news sources. And blog citations, so blogs citing academic research are fairly rare, but they provide good evidence of public interest. Blogs are often, the science blogs particularly, are often the transition between academic research and public understanding of it. Another thing you can do with Altmetrics is try to evaluate other output types. Books, academic videos, data, grey literature, these are all kinds of things that academics sometimes produce and often get ignored in evaluations, but these are things that you can get Altmetrics for to help you evaluate. And conference papers as well. So in some fields they're as valuable or even more valuable than journal articles. So to finish, what is going to happen in the near future, or what would I like to happen in the near future? So I'd like to see new applications of Altmetrics to understand science and the process of science impact. And I'm looking forward to the new ways of exploring data and COVID and misinformation sessions today which are going to give us some insights into that, showing us the near future. And also, very importantly, success stories from librarians, evaluators, publishers, editors and other users about how altmetrics are used in practice by them and how they've found them to be useful, the challenges they've faced. So I think this is what we're really lacking more than anything for Altmetrics. So I'm looking forward to the Altmetrics in Action session today to hear a couple of examples of that. So this is really an urgent need to help us to progress from theory to practice. And I'd like to see evidence of how Altmetrics has positively influenced decisions, where a better decision has been taken because of the evidence provided by Altmetrics. So this will really help us to understand how they can be used effectively. So thanks very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to hearing your suggestions for the near future next.